Hello everyone and welcome to the biology lecture series, and today we'll be discussing the topic respiration. So we have already discussed some of the topics in the previous lecture, and today we'll be discussing about the rest of the topics. Okay, so in the previous lectures I've given you the brief introduction about the respiration, what is respiration and what was metabolisms, what are the components of the metabolism. Okay, and then we studied about the aerobic and anaerobic respiration also. So I've given you a brief idea about both these kinds of respiration. Then we studied about the types of respiration. So we studied about the external, internal, as well as the cellular respiration. Then we studied about the respiratory system in the lower organisms. All right, and then we studied about the respiratory organism in the earthworm, in grasshopper, and then finally we studied about the respiratory system in the complex organisms such as humans. Okay, we also solved some of the objective type questions related to that topic. All right, and in this session we'll be studying about the mechanism of gaseous exchange between the tissue and the blood. Okay, so how gas exchange takes place between the tissue and the blood. So this is known as the internal respiration. So what happens in the internal respiration? Or let's start with the external respiration first. So if we talk about the external respiration, okay, what happens during external respiration? The oxygen from the atmosphere. Okay, so this is here the exchange of gases takes place between the organism and the environment, you can say. So oxygen which is present in the atmosphere, it enters into the lungs, and from the lungs it will enter where? It will enter into the bloodstream. Correct? And then next was the internal respiration. What happens during internal respiration? So here the exchange of the gases, okay, here you can say the exchange of gases, it takes place between the blood and the tissue. Between the blood and the tissue. Clear? All right. So here we'll be studying about the mechanism of gaseous exchange between the tissue and the blood. So that's why we can call it as internal respiration. So what happens during internal respiration? So if this is the blood, now blood carries the oxygen, and this oxygen, this diffuses into the tissues, and here when the oxygen enters into the tissues, then it will be used up in the process known as respiration, which generates energy in the form of ATP. Now within the tissues, due to the process of the respiration, carbon dioxide is produced. Okay, so here carbon dioxide is produced, and this carbon dioxide is that diffuses into the blood by the simple process known as the diffusion. All right, so carbon dioxide which is produced due to the respiration. So within the cell or the tissues, the amount or the volume of the, or you can say the concentration of the carbon dioxide is more as compared to the surrounding. So that's why the carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood. All right, and similarly oxygen also diffuses into the tissues. Clear? So let's start with this lecture. Now when the air, it enters into the lungs through the nostril, trachea and the bronchi. So when we were studying about the respiratory system of the humans, then we studied the air from the atmosphere which is rich in the oxygen, it enters through the nostrils, and from the nostrils it will enter into the trachea, which is also known as the windpipe. Okay, trachea is known as the windpipe, and it also consists of the cartilaginous rings that helps the prevention of the collapse of the trachea in the absence of the oxygen. Now trachea further leads into the bronchi. So there are two bronchi, left and the right bronchi. Now this bronchi enters into the this enters into the lungs. And further bronchi divide into bronchioles. Okay. So bronchi, it enters into the lungs and it divides into the bronchioles. Now from bronchioles, it moves into the thin walled alveolar sacs known as the alveoli. And in alveoli, what happens? There is the exchange of the gases. There is exchange of gases within the alveoli. Alright, now alveoli are rich in blood capillaries. That's why exchange of gases can take place. Now, at this place, oxygen from air diffuses into the blood and reaches all the cells and the tissues of the body. And this oxygen now diffuses into the cell. Okay, this is clear. Now, the oxygen is utilized for the oxidation of the food and production of the energy. And this process, what is this process known as? This process is known as respiration. Okay. Now this process, respiration, takes place where? What is the site of respiration? Mitochondria. So it takes place inside the mitochondria. Now as a result of this, carbon dioxide is produced within the cells. Okay. So energy, so main purpose of the respiration, now we know, is the production of the energy, and carbon dioxide is also produced as a byproduct. Okay, and this elimination of this carbon dioxide is very important. Otherwise, it can be toxic to the human beings. So carbon dioxide, when it reacts with the, or when it combines with the hemoglobin, then it forms carboxyhemoglobin. Okay. So this carbon dioxide is produced in the cells. Due to this increased concentration of the carbon dioxide, it diffuses into the blood and is brought back to the alveoli. Okay, so this carbon dioxide, by the process of diffusion, it enters into the blood and is brought back to the alveoli, and it is expelled out finally out of the lungs through trachea and the nostrils. Okay, so this is how gaseous exchange is taking place. Clear? This is also known as internal respiration. Clear? Now, respiration is controlled by the respiratory center situated in the medulla oblongata of the brain. Okay, so medulla oblongata of the brain, it consists of the respiratory centers. So what happens whenever there is a change in the carbon dioxide level in the body or in the blood? So whenever there is a change in the pH also. So the pH of the blood is dependent on the concentration of the carbon dioxide as well as the protons. Okay, so we can say that the blood pH, this is dependent on the what? This is dependent on the carbon dioxide and the H+ ions. So whenever there is a change in the pH, the chemoreceptors, they get activated. So these chemoreceptors, they activate the respiratory centers, which are situated in the medulla oblongata of the hindbrain. So brain is divided into hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain. So the hindbrain is the region where the medulla oblongata is present, and this medulla oblongata consists of the respiratory centers. Okay, now you know the breathing occurs involuntarily. All right, so it is controlled by what? It is controlled by the autonomous nervous system. Okay, it is controlled by autonomous nervous system. Clear? So this also autonomous nervous system, this helps in the involuntary breathing of the, so for breathing we don't have to think. All right, it happens by itself, means it is involuntary, and this involuntary breathing is controlled by the autonomous nervous system. Now, under normal conditions, rate of the breathing is 15 to 18 times per minute. So this is the normal breathing rate. Okay, but during the vigorous exercise, the demand for the oxygen increases, due to which rate of breathing increases by about 20 to 25 times. So during the vigorous exercise, you need a lot of energy. So because of this energy, there is a lot of respiration and the oxygen demand also increases. Why the oxygen demand increases? Because the energy demand increases, and by the oxidation of the respiratory substrate or by the oxidation of the assimilated food, energy is generated. So the respiration rate as well as the breathing rate increases. What is the difference between breathing and respiration? We have studied in the previous lecture. So in breathing, there is no generation of ATP. Okay, while in respiration, what happens? In respiration, ATP is produced, means energy is produced. So this is one of the major difference between breathing and the respiration. Okay, respiration also involves the oxidation of the food material, whereas breathing, it doesn't involve the oxidation of the respiratory substrate, or you can say oxidation of the assimilated food. Okay, and breathing takes place at one level, at the lung system level, whereas respiration takes place at the lung system level as well as the cellular level also. Clear? Now the total area for the gas exchange covered through 300 million alveoli is about 36 to 72 meters square in each lung. Alright, this is clear. Now let me introduce you the term respiratory quotient. This is very important. Respiratory quotients for different respiratory substrates such as carbohydrates, proteins and fat, this respiratory quotient is different. Okay, so if we know the respiratory quotient for a particular substrate that is being oxidized during the respiration, we can tell whether the respiratory substrate is carbohydrate, protein or fats. So let's first look at the definition of the respiratory quotient. So it is defined as the ratio of the volumes of carbon dioxide liberated to the oxygen used during the respiration. So during respiration, what happens? Let's have a look at the equation of the respiration. It is C6H12O6. This in the presence of oxygen. Okay, and this process is known as oxidation. This will liberate what? It will liberate carbon dioxide plus water plus energy is released. Okay, if you balance the equation, you can add 6 here and 6 here. So you can see, if we talk about the respiratory quotient of the glucose, so this is glucose molecule. Alright, so for glucose, what will be the RQ value? So glucose is a carbohydrate. So you can see 6 carbon dioxide are liberated and 6 oxygen are used. So we can write 6 carbon dioxide liberated divided by 6 oxygen used. Okay, so you can cancel these. Okay, so what will you get? You will get the answer 1. So the RQ value of the carbohydrate such as glucose, it is 1, or you can also say unity. Unity is 1. Clear? So now you know if the RQ value is 1, then you can tell the respiratory substrate will be glucose or it will be a carbohydrate. Okay, so hence the RQ value for glucose or carbohydrate is 1. Okay, if you talk about the fat, it is 0.7. Alright, and for proteins it is 0.5. Whereas for organic acid such as malic acid, so malic acid is a organic acid. For malic acid, the RQ value is more than 1. It can be around 4 also. Okay, so you can calculate the RQ value if you know this equation. Okay, if the fats are oxidized, how much carbon dioxide released, how much oxygen is used. If the proteins are oxidized, how much carbon dioxide is released, how much oxygen is used. If you know these values, then you can calculate the RQ value. But generally, you can say for fats, the RQ value is 0.7. and for proteins the RQ value is 0.5, and for organic acid the RQ value is always more than 1. Okay, so if you get a question where they have given you the RQ value, so if they say the RQ value is 1, then you can say the substrate will be glucose or carbohydrate, and if it's given the RQ value is more than 1, then you can say the respiratory substrate is organic acid. Clear? The next question, let's now have a look at some of the respiratory disorders. Okay, now there are a lot of disorders that are related to the respiration. Okay, and some of these disorders are due to the smoking also. All right, now first let's have a look at the one of the disorder known as the emphysema. Okay, what is emphysema? Now it occurs due to the infection or smoking. All right, so what happens in emphysema? It occurs due to the obstruction in the bronchioles. So bronchioles, there were two bronchia, right, and the left bronchia, which enter into each lung. Okay, and then they divide into the bronchioles, and the end of the bronchioles is known as alveoli. Now it is emphysema due to the obstruction of the bronchioles caused by breaking of the alveolar septa. Okay, so here what happens? Bronchodilators and oxygen therapy are used for curing these diseases. Okay, now next is the asthma. So what happens during asthma? The air passages are narrowed and it leads to the obstruction in the breathing. So this is what happens in the asthma. So asthma is very common now these days, and because of the increasing pollution also, asthma cases are rising, as well as due to a lot of allergies also. Asthma is rising because this polluted air, it consists of a lot of pollutants that can cause allergies, and it can lead to asthma. Now pneumonia, next is pneumonia. So what is pneumonia? The lymph and the mucus accumulate in the alveoli and the bronchioles. Lymph, we have already studied when we were studying about the blood. Lymph, it is devoid of the RBCs as well as the WBCs. Alright, so lymph and the mucus, it accumulate in the alveoli as well as the bronchioles during the pneumonia. Now pneumonia is caused by the bacterial as well as the viral infections, and pneumonia can also be life-threatening if not treated. And the person here is not able to breathe. Why? Because of the accumulation of the mucus as well as the lymph in the alveoli and the bronchioles. Okay, now next is bronchitis. What happens in bronchitis? There is a swelling in the living membrane of the respiratory tract due to excessive smoking. So bronchitis is due to the excessive smoking. Now next is the tuberculosis. So tuberculosis, so this disease can be fully treated now. You can do a course. So the course is for around 6 months. Okay, so it is due to the bacterial infection in the lungs. So that bacteria causes tuberculosis. And what is the name of the bacteria? Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is caused by the bacteria Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Okay, this is clear. Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Now next is the pleurisy. This is the inflammation of the lung membrane. Okay, and this is known as the pleurisy. What happens here? There is the inflammation of the lung membrane. Lung membrane, what is the lung membrane? Pleural membrane. So lung is covered by a membrane which is known as the pleura. Okay, and you can also call it as the pleural membrane. So there is inflammation in the membrane of the lung. So there is inflammation in the pleural membrane, and this condition is known as pleurisy. Now, sudden contraction of the diaphragm along with loud closure of the glottis causes hiccups. Okay, so this is not a disease, but hiccups you must have encountered in your day-to-day life. So this is due to the sudden contraction of the diaphragm along with the loud closure of the glottis. So these terms I have already explained you. What is glottis, what is diaphragm? So diaphragm is a structure that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And diaphragm also plays a role in the exhalation as well as the inspiration. Okay, so what happens? There is a sudden contraction of the diaphragm which leads to the very loud closure of the glottis, and this called as hiccups. And you can easily get rid of these hiccups if you drink hot water. Now, sudden and the violent expulsion of air through the mouth and nose, this is known as sneezing. So, what is sneezing? Sudden and violent expulsion of the air through the mouth as well as through the nose. This is known as sneezing. So, whenever you encounter some allergen, then the body wants to get rid of that, and that's why you sneeze, okay, to get rid of that allergen. All right. In case of cough and cold also, you sneeze a lot. All right. So sneezing is the sudden and violent expulsion of the air. Now let's study about the anaerobic respiration. All right. I have already introduced to this topic in the first lecture, fermentation. Fermentation is also known as anaerobic respiration. Means, what does anaerobic respiration means? It is taking place or in the absence of the oxygen, or you can say here no oxygen is utilized. All right, this is known as anaerobic respiration. Now, anaerobic respiration is also known as fermentation, and fermentation can be of two types: alcoholic fermentation and the lactic acid fermentation. Okay. Now, what is fermentation? It is the slow decomposition of the organic matter into simpler substances in the presence of enzymes. This is known as the fermentation. Now, this process is used for the preparation of the alcoholic beverages in the presence of yeast and in the absence of the oxygen. Okay. So, alcoholic fermentation. So, yeast is an example where alcoholic fermentation takes place. What is alcoholic fermentation? During this, an alcohol is produced which is known as the ethyl alcohol. So what happens here? The glucose, I've already told you, by the process of glycolysis is first converted into pyruvic acid. Now this pyruvic acid, it changes into what? It changes into the ethyl alcohol. Okay, ethyl alcohol is C2H5OH. It is C2H5OH, and along with it carbon dioxide is also produced, and little bit, very small amount of ATP is also produced. Okay, this is known as the alcoholic fermentation. Now another one is the lactic acid fermentation. Now what happens in lactic acid fermentation? Pyruvate or the pyruvic acid, which is produced by the process known as glycolysis. So this pyruvic acid is converted into lactic acid. Okay, plus carbon dioxide and 2 ATP are also generated. Okay, so this is known as the lactic acid fermentation. Here lactic acid is produced. Okay, so this is known as lactic acid fermentation. Okay, this is clear. Now lactic acid fermentation takes place either in the lactic acid bacteria known as lactobacillus, or it can also take place in the muscle cell. All right, during the vigorous exercise. So whenever you do a lot of vigorous exercise, you do a lot of physical activities, then there is the lack of oxygen. There is lack of oxygen in the muscles, and due to this, what happens? Fermentation occur, lactic acid fermentation occur, and this leads to the accumulation of the lactic acid, and this is the reason for the muscle cramps. Okay, while if you talk about the yeast, this is happening in yeast. Yeast undergoes alcoholic fermentation. Now this process is used in the preparation of the alcoholic beverages. Here what happens? The glucose and the fructose, they are converted into ethyl alcohol. So ethanol is ethyl alcohol. Now it is a type of anaerobic respiration. Now let's have a look at the difference between the aerobic and the anaerobic respiration. So some of the difference you must be already knowing. We have discussed about these processes. So aerobic respiration, it occurs in all living cells of the higher plants. Alright, if we talk about the anaerobic respiration, it occurs in some bacteria, some fungi, okay, germinating seeds also. In germinating seeds also anaerobic respiration takes place, and it also takes place in the fleshy fruit muscles. Okay. Now aerobic respiration, as the name states, it requires the oxygen, whereas anaerobic respiration, it doesn't require oxygen. It takes place in the absence of the oxygen. That's why it is also known as fermentation. And fermentation, we have discussed, it is a two type: alcoholic fermentation, and another one is the lactic acid fermentation. Okay. Now let's have a look at the other differences. So in aerobic respiration, the end products are carbon dioxide and water. Whereas in anaerobic respiration, the end products are alcohol. So alcohol, which alcohol is produced? C2H5OH. So this is the ethanol. Ethanol is produced. Okay, this happens during the alcoholic fermentation. Or lactic acid produced. This is produced during the lactic acid fermentation. And apart from this, carbon dioxide is produced. If we talk about aerobic respiration, here the oxidation of one molecule of glucose releases large amount of energy. So energy is released in the form of ATP. So here 38 ATP molecules are released during the aerobic respiration, whereas only 2 ATP are produced during the anaerobic respiration. So very less amount of energy is released during the anaerobic respiration. Now aerobic respiration, all the reaction except the reaction of the glycolysis, they take place inside the mitochondria. So what is the site of aerobic respiration? It is the mitochondria, where the Krebs cycle is going on. Okay. So glycolysis. So glycolysis is the common pathway for both aerobic as well as the anaerobic respiration. So what happens? By the process of glycolysis, what is happening? The glucose is being converted into pyruvic acid through the process of glycolysis. Pyruvic acid, we can also write it as pyruvate. Now this pyruvate, okay, takes part in the Krebs cycle. So this pyruvate is first converted into acetyl coenzyme A, and then acetyl coenzyme A can enter into the mitochondria, where Krebs cycle is going on, and here the glucose molecule is finally converted into the energy. Okay, so energy is produced here, whereas in anaerobic respiration, all the reaction takes place in the cytoplasm. Now next point, aerobic respiration, organic compounds are completely oxidized and high amount of energy is released, whereas in anaerobic respiration, organic compounds are incompletely oxidized and very small amount of energy is released. Now aerobic respiration, this is not toxic to plants, whereas aerobic respiration is toxic to the higher plants, because here ethyl alcohol is produced. Okay, this is clear. And we were talking about the glycolysis. So glycolysis is a common pathway for both aerobic as well as the anaerobic respiration. So you know the pyruvic acid which is produced. So this pyruvic acid, okay, also known as the pyruvate, it can either go for complete oxidation or it can go for incomplete oxidation. Okay, so during incomplete oxidation, we can call it as fermentation. And if it goes for complete oxidation, we can call it as aerobic respiration. Alright, so this was the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. And we'll discuss rest of the topics in the next lecture. Thank you very much for listening.